Tony Wheeler come down and give up his time for us tonight. Okay. So how do you want to do? We're going to be a bit fluid tonight. Please sit down. Yeah, we're going to be a bit fluid tonight and go through these slides. We don't have a clicker. We wouldn't be that prepared, but.
So what do I do? I just press the button down for the next one.
Press the button down. Yeah. So.
Okay. So we're going back long ago. It looks like I'm about 16 and my wife is 12, but actually I just got an MBA and this was a graduation night, and this was in London in 1972. So that's how long ago it is. And Maureen and I decided we were going to take a year off, and we were going to get travel out of our system, which didn't quite work. And what we did is we did a sort of magic bus hippie trail thing. And you know, this has worked for me ever since, because a couple of years ago I did a BBC radio program in London where we played music from the hippie trail, and that was the CD collection they made from that radio program. But that was my magic bus. Maureen and I bought that car in London. We paid about $150 for it, and we said we'll just drive it as far as it goes, and if it breaks down we'll just walk away from it and leave it. We got as far as, there we are in Switzerland, and pre-global warming, so that's July in Switzerland. We got as far as Istanbul. You're looking down from 30,000 feet, and you know, Europe's on one side, Asia is on the other. And back in '72 there were no bridges, so you had to get on a ferry and cross from Europe to Asia. So there was a real feeling of, you know, going from one side to another. We kept on going across Turkey. Mount Ararat in the background is where Noah landed the ark. After the 40 days and 40 nights, he came in to land there. And remember that mountain, because we were going to come back there later in this little excursion. We carried on. Iran, and in '72, you didn't have to be in, you know, headscarfed and hijab and so on. You could wear pretty much what you pleased. And everyone was so friendly in Iran. And I was back in Iran again last year, and they are still so friendly. We got all the way to Afghanistan, and in Afghanistan, we sold that car for a $5 profit. And, you know, I was telling people for years that was Osama bin Laden's getaway vehicle, and if they just put some sort of tracker on it, you know, it would have saved the CIA and the FBI and everybody else a lot of trouble. But anyway, the car stopped there, and we carried on and eventually got to Australia. But doing that in that Mini has really worked remarkably well for me. I get to do BBC radio programs about the hippie trail. And a few years ago, when they launched the Mini in China, I got a phone call from BMW China saying, we're launching the Mini in China. We know you drove a Mini to Afghanistan back in the '70s. Lonely Planet's a big name in China. Can we fly you to China to launch the Mini? What do you say? So you know, I did go to China and, you know, help launch the Mini there. But Afghanistan in '72 was a very different place. It was a great place in '72, and I got a lot of friends and connections and so on. One of them is a couple who live here in Melbourne who got into Afghan carpets in the '70s in Afghanistan and still get carpets out of Afghanistan today. I bought that carpet from them last year. But one of the people who was in Afghanistan at that stage in the '70s was Tom Freston, who went on to start MTV. So, you know, the MTV beginnings were in Kabul in Afghanistan. And he's a, you know, Viacom and everything else, a billionaire these days. But he still does a lot of philanthropic stuff in Afghanistan. He still goes back there, putting his effort back into Afghanistan. But if I have one great regret of my traveling life, it's that I was in Afghanistan in '72 and I did not go up to Bamiyan to see the Buddhas. That photograph of the Bamiyan Buddhas was taken by Alexandra Copeland, whose carpets I showed you a couple of shots ago from here in Melbourne. I finally got to Bamiyan in 2006, and no Buddhas anymore. The Taliban destroyed them. So that's the greatest regret of my life, that I had the opportunity to go there and I didn't take it up. But if you want to see Buddhas, big ones, there are lots of them in China. And I spend a lot of time in China, and I've seen lots. These are the Yungan caves, and that very first photograph of me with the sign saying, tourist halts here, that was at the Yungan caves. So Buddhas I can still find. But back in 72, we got to the border between Pakistan and India, and the border was only open for 3 hours a week. So you had to be there on Thursday night when the border opened at 9 o'clock to cross over, and Maureen, my wife's in the middle there looking towards us. The woman looking over her shoulder in the pink t-shirt later on wrote a book called A Woman's Guide to Adultery, which became an ITV television series, and wrote a Lonely Planet guidebook. So that was a very useful meeting there. You go back there today, and every night they close the border between India and Pakistan, and there's a lot of marching back and forth, and it is just a fantastic tourist attraction. And I was there in 2012 and saw that closing of the border. 2012, Maureen and I went back up through Pakistan, right up to China, up the Karakoram Highway. Just a fantastic trip. One of the things I get to do a lot these days is do fantastic trips, and that was one of them. But back in 1972, we got to that symbol of enduring love, the Taj Mahal, on our first wedding anniversary, and started a little thing of trying to get our photograph taken somewhere every October the 7th for another wedding anniversary. We went to Varanasi and met holy cows. We went up to Kathmandu when you found very interesting shops in Kathmandu. Of course, we never inhaled, but you know, Kathmandu it's still an interesting place. I still love it. We crossed over to Thailand. We hitchhiked from Bangkok down to Singapore because we had so little money by this stage. And when you got to Singapore in 72, at all the sort of government offices and banks and things, you found these signs saying, males with long hair will be attended to last, because the government of Singapore did not approve of long-haired hippies. And if you had hair like that, you could just go back and wait till respectable people had done their business. Great place, Singapore. Still is. We got down to Bali and we hitched a ride on that yacht out of Manoa Harbour in Bali, and we sailed down to Australia and arrived in Exmouth on the Northwest Cape. You know, and if we'd done this 30 years later, we would have been sent straight to Nauru. You know, a shonky boat sailing out of Indonesia. What happens to you? You know, no, you're not a startup. You're going to Nauru. Forget starting up a business in Australia. But we did. We lived in Sydney for a year. There we are on our wedding anniversary again. In 72, the Opera House behind us still under construction. The Opera House didn't open until late 72. And during that year in Sydney, we wrote the first Lonely Planet guidebook. All of Asia in 96 pages, sold for all of $1.80. And it sold so amazingly well, although it was never sold outside of Australia and New Zealand. But it sold so well that we decided, let's do another book. Maybe we can make a startup business out of this. So we bought a motorcycle, and we then rode around Southeast Asia for the next 12 months, meeting lots of interesting people. There was a cyclist who'd just ridden all the way to Indonesia from Belgium. And we stood by the roadside and took a few notes with him and carried on. And at the end of the year, sat down in a backstreet hotel in Singapore and put together the second book. And this, of course, was long before computers. So, you know, we typed it out on a typewriter and sent it off, and it was typeset. And the typesetting came back in things called galleys, and you cut them up. And what we're doing there is we're making maps. And every little word on a map had to be cut out on paper and glued down on a page. I mean, the technology. Whew. But only a few years later, we're here in Melbourne, not very far from here. And there is the first Lonely Planet computer. And we got that for, do you know, I think it cost us about, I hate to say, I think about $20,000. You know, and it's got far less computing power than my phone. And it ran, you know, anybody remembers 5 1/4 flop? Ah, yeah, that's what I like. 5 1/4 floppies or 3.5 floppies. This thing ran 8-inch floppies. You know, they were like 78 RPM records. And there were no printers in those days, so it was hooked up to a typewriter behind me. And we bought that thing for doing invoicing and accounting. And I came back to the office one day, and Jim Hart, our partner at that time, Jim said, "Tony, I've got something here which I think you might find interesting. It's called word processing." I said, "What's an interesting word? Who invented that?" And that was the start of, well, word processing worked so well that we then had to start buying things called Kpros. Kpros, this was, Apple were just starting to make computers then, but they only did capital letters. You could have no lowercase on an Apple computer. And DOS hadn't been invented. These things ran CP/M, and that was the sort of the state-of-the-art computer language. It's amazing how things have changed. Anyway, Lonely Planet grew and did lots of books, and we did things like the Palm Pilots. There we are. Everybody remember Palm Pilots?
Sure, that was probably
it wasn't at all, but Palm Pilot was like a smartphone, except it wasn't a phone. It was just the other things that. But we did guidebooks on Palm Pilots, and we never made any money out of them. But it was the sort of cutting edge of things to do those days. But we did books on everywhere, and what I really liked about Lonely Planet, and what I always pushed, was we did books on the crazy places. Somebody else can do France and Spain. We're going to do Timor and Yemen and Saudi Arabia. We even did at one stage a guidebook to Afghanistan. It was a select market, but we knew who the market was, and we knew they needed it. In '96, we did a guidebook to Afghanistan and Antarctica. That's Maureen. I didn't write it, but we went down to try it out in '96. Maureen's looking towards the camera again. And I remember when we did that, some of my staff said, Tony, you've had some great ideas over the years, and they've been fun to do, but who needs a guidebook to Antarctica? There are not enough tourists going to Antarctica to make it worthwhile. Well, the Antarctica Guide has gone through about 5 editions now, and the current edition is not only available in English, it's also available in Chinese, because there are enough Chinese tourists going down to Antarctica to make it worth having a guidebook to Antarctica. In fact, when I go to China today, Lonely Planet's a big deal in China, and there's the N Beer pub in Beijing, which has 500 different beers, and their bar, as you can see, is totally made up of Lonely Planet guidebooks. It's like it's only the front of them, but it looks like it. I was in China in Shanghai last year, and actually I met these people at Intrepid Travel, the two people who run 54 Traveller. It's a Chinese adventure travel company. And they're great consumers of Lonely Planet guides, and they're sending young Chinese out and working with, because of course we're great adventure travelers in Australia, so they work with Intrepid here in Melbourne for a lot of their adventure travel stuff. Lonely Planet's Chinese partner puts out a whole series of regional guidebooks to China. I recognize them as Lonely Planet guidebooks, but I've got no idea where they are because I don't have enough Chinese. They're regional guides to each part of China. They've been written in Chinese from the very start. They aren't necessarily translated. The Tibet one is, of course, but not all of them are translated into English. They're Chinese guidebooks, but they're done by Lonely Planet. Anyway, Maureen and I eventually sold out of Lonely Planet. We'd been there, we'd done it. It was time for something else. They're nice figures. I'm not even sure if they're true or not. But and then we thought, well, what do we do? We had a foundation within Lonely Planet. We thought at one stage, we're making all this money from the developing world, we should put money back in. So the Lonely Planet Foundation became the Planet Wheeler Foundation, and my daughter, who's the blonde one there, she helps run it, and that one recent trip to Africa, that was her itinerary, the places she went to, and the projects that we work with in Africa. We've got about 70 projects that Planet Wheeler works with, mainly education and health. I'm also involved with an organization in California, which was actually Silicon Valley money started it off, called Global Heritage Fund, which does archaeology projects in the developing world, with the idea that archaeology, you get your PhD for studying this archaeology site, but you have to involve the local community. It's the local community involvement that protects the site, because the people there run the guest houses, and they're the guides, and they sell the postcards and run the cafe and so on. So Global Heritage really works on not just the archaeology, but the community involvement with it. And I'm their sort of tourism expert, and it's great for me because I get to go to these amazing archaeology sites, and I get shown around by the person who's excavating the site. This is Banteay Shamar in Cambodia, which everybody knows Angkor Wat, but not so many people get to Banteay Shamar. I still do things with Lonely Planet. they did a book last year called Epic Drives, and I helped to write that. I wrote some of the epic drives in it, and then I got to drive around. We had Elon Musk mentioned in Elon Musk's Tesla, driving around England, and that's in Wales actually, promoting the book. But a few years ago, when George Bush said there were 3 countries that are so bad they make up an axis of evil, my first thought was, well, I've got to go there. What do? If North Korea, yes. Iraq, yes. Iran, yes. So I went around his axis of evil and a bunch of other countries and wrote a book about it called Badlands. And I've got a few copies here. If anybody wants to buy a copy of Badlands, I've got a couple. And I went back to Afghanistan for that. And even in Afghanistan, you met tourists. I met these 2 French motorcyclists at Bandi Amir, which is these amazing lakes in the center of Afghanistan. I took that photograph, and they actually wrote a book about their motorcycle travels, and that ended up as the front cover photograph. But I also went to North Korea. Whoa, the wackiest country I have ever been to. The mass games. It's the MCG. It's a 100,000 seat stadium with this amazing dancers across this platform, and people flipping up cards in the back to make different pictures, and they flip up. This is Pyongyang in the winter, and the cold winds are blowing across, and the women in their blue outfits are swaying one way and the other, and then the cards flip over, and it's the face of, this was back in the Kim Jong-il era, and then the dancing army comes on. And look, when they decide wars by whose army dances best, my money's on the North Koreans. I don't believe they can really build a missile. They can't build a bicycle, so how can they build a missile? But as far as dancing, their army dances better than anybody. I had so much fun with Badlands that I went on to do Darklands, which was more dark and bad countries. And one of them I went to was Bougainville, just north of Australia. And the island, it's this dystopian vision, something out of Mad Max. And you go to the main town there, and you can see what's happened to the Shell petrol station. It's gone back to the jungle. Just amazing things in Bougainville, including the wreck of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft. This was the best American takedown until bin Laden came along, because Yamamoto was the guy who plotted the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the Americans had broken the Japanese naval code, and they knew he was going to fly over Bougainville, and they intercepted his aircraft and shot it down. And 70 odd years later, the wreckage is still there in the jungle. And you can trek through the jungle, and wow, that's just a fantastic thing to do. But I get to do lots of other fantastic things. The Plymouth Banjo Challenge. The idea is you go to London and you buy the cheapest car you can find, and you drive it down the coast of Africa. My cheap car, Maureen looking towards the camera again, is the Mitsubishi with the door open, which we bought in London on a Sunday for 300 quid, and we set off on Thursday, and you drive down the coast of West Africa, and if you get to the finish line, you have to give the car away, because they have an auction and all the cars are sold and the money goes to local charities. And our 300 quid car got us down there. We're photographing the other cars driving down the beach, and we sold it for twice what we paid for it. We didn't get the money, went to charity, but it was good fun, it was great. A couple of years ago, with a bunch of friends, we chartered this plane out of Moorabbin and flew around places in the north of Australia, places that have great airport terminals. We do build a good airport terminal in Australia. I show this to my European friends, say, well, this is our international airport at Mitchell Plateau, and they like that. But last year, one of the places I went to was Chernobyl. I thought, look, it's been the radiation. I'm actually holding up a Geiger counter there, and that is reactor 4 right behind me. That was the one that blew up in '86. And now you can go there, you go to Kiev in Ukraine, and they run tours down to Chernobyl every morning, and it is the most dystopian again. There's the school, as if the kids have just dropped their books and said, things aren't looking good in Chernobyl today, we're taking you on a bus to somewhere else. And you go back there, and it's just amazing. There's the supermarket, the shelves have been, people have come in, the food may be radioactive, but we'll have it. But they left the supermarket trolleys behind. Amazing place. I went to Sudan last year. well, we're having all this trouble about Sudanese in Melbourne. They're the friendliest people in Sudan. I love the place. I went to Panama last year because I'd never been through the Panama Canal, and I managed to arrive there the day the Panama Papers story broke. So I went around, I looked up where it was. I'd never heard of Mossack Fonseca, good accountants, but I went around to their office and did a selfie in front of it. And I also went to Cuba last year and had a drink with Ernest and Fidel looking over us. And this was again part of my global heritage archaeology projects, and went up to by helicopter to Mirador in Guatemala. God, I get to do great things. But I spend a couple of months in London. I've got a house in London, and I go there every year. And I was thinking a couple of years ago, this is so boring, you know. You get on a plane and you fly to Singapore or Dubai or somewhere, and you get on another plane and you fly to London. Wasn't it much better all those years ago when you got on a plane, it took you a week to, sorry, that's the plane. That's the planes that just stop. What did I show before? There we are. Back in those days, you know, it took you a week to fly to Australia, and you stopped overnight. You know, you got off the plane and you stayed in the hotel and got on the plane again the next day. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do that sort of thing again? Not just one stop, but say 24 stops. So I did it. I did it on Ryanair and EasyJet and Pegasus. We've just seen a Pegasus plane going off the runway in Turkey a couple of days ago. I did 2 flights. I tried to do 1 flight on each airline, but Pegasus I flew twice. It took me a month, but I did fly from London to Melbourne in 24 stops. 24 different cheap airlines, including Jetstar and Virgin. And I got here. It was all good. You know, I spent a day or 2 in each place, and it was 1 hour at a time. Anybody can manage Jetstar for 1 hour. 2 hours is too long. But then last year I thought, why not do that original trip again? And I met this bunch of people in Melbourne who were going to drive to London in MGBs. And there's my red MGB, which I've just sold a week or 2 ago, which was in 1973. So it was going right back to that time when we did that first hippie trail trip. And this time we started from Bangkok. So we put the cars out in someone's place in Dandenong. We put them into shipping containers and we shipped them up to Bangkok and got them out of the containers and started off from Bangkok on a 4-month drive to London. Here we are crossing the border between Thailand into Cambodia, and we carried on and we got to, here I am with a good map on the side of the car showing where we're going. And that's Xi'an in China, which is the actual start of the Silk Road. If you're following the Silk Road to Europe, that's where it starts. And everywhere we went, particularly in China, everybody was just interested in they wanted to look at the map and see where we'd come from. And also they wanted to all sit in the cars. And I remember I had one young guy sat in the car in Shanghai and said, "Oh, this is great." And they said, "Look, a window winder. I've heard of window winders, but I've never seen one." There you go, you see, in China it's all electric. And China has amazing, I said about big Buddhas, well, this is Maijishan, which is again a global heritage project, a cave temple site in the far west of China. It's just amazing. Definitely go there and see it, and lots of big Buddhas. But when you get out in the far, far west of China, you have never seen so many wind turbines. You know, you drive for 100 kilometers and there are wind turbines stretching to the horizon, and every, wow, you think. China, it blows you away what they're doing there. And the wind turbines in the far west of China with our old MGBs driving through it was just an amazing sight. And then we crossed into Kazakhstan, and immediately it was potholes. There was potholes for the next month, all the way across all of the stands. But Kazakhstan I'd been to once before. And the reason I went to Kazakhstan about 10 years ago was Kazakhstan is where the Russians have launched all of their space launches. From Sputnik 1 onwards, right up to whatever's gone up to the space station last week, has gone from Kazakhstan. Well, I got invited to go there to see a Soyuz launch going up to the International Space Station. And there were a bunch of NASA people there, and they said, if this was Cape Canaveral, we would be 4 kilometers away in a concrete bunker. Well, you can see where the photographers were. And they said to us, if you want to get closer, just, we're not going to complain, just, get a bit closer. Well, it was fantastic. There were the three people going up. The Russian cosmonaut mission leader in the middle, the American NASA astronaut on this side, and over there, the computer game entrepreneur who was paying $30 million to go up there. That's all it cost, $30 million, and you have to learn Russian, and you have to do a 6-month training course. He had the money, he did it. But there were about 12 of us went down there to see this. Here are some of the other people who went down to see it. Sergey Brin, Larry Page, and Eric Schmidt was there as well. And what do they say about, big companies, they shouldn't put all their people in shonky old Tupolovs. We all flew down there in the same old Tupolov. Charles Simonyi has been up there twice to the space station. He got no frequent flyer miles. He had to pay the full money second time round, but he was one of the first 20 people at Microsoft, and they say he did Word and Excel. So it was a bunch of interesting people there to see the space launch. But meanwhile, back in Kazakhstan, we crossed the border into Kyrgyzstan, which was the most amazing country of the whole trip, because what does anybody know about Kyrgyzstan? It was beautiful. It was like, I'm thinking deserts and the Islamic world, and instead it's Switzerland and snow-capped mountains, some bad roads, although we didn't drive that one. we left the cars in a town and took that sort of jeep thing up to this beautiful valley. I mean, we're in Switzerland, aren't we? Wonderful. So Kyrgyzstan was really good. And then further on in Kyrgyzstan, suddenly we're in Mongolia, and there's my car, and the horsemen and the snow-capped mountains. Well, it was an old English car. It did break down occasionally, but it kept on going. And we did get to places where it was really the Islamic world, and pretty much like Iran. And then we got to Turkmenistan, which after North Korea is the wackiest country I've ever been to. Just amazing. And this was the wackiest moment, because this was the statue of the president for life at one stage, except he died. And he built this solid gold statue of himself and set it up there, and it rotates. And it starts facing the rising sun, and then it rotates around to the setting sun. And I showed that photograph in America recently, and I said, look, it's Donald Trump. In 5 years' time, it'll be there in DC, and it will rotate, just like in Turkmenistan. And the city was, Ashgabat, the capital city, was empty. You just drove by these streets of apartments and no people. Where was everybody? It was after North Korea, the wackiest country I've ever been to. And it has the world's largest indoor Ferris wheel. Now, we could have had that. All we had to do was put the Southern Cross thing indoors, and it would have been just as good, wouldn't it? My daughter joined me in Iran, and now she's wearing a headscarf, you see. My daughter Tashi, who we saw earlier on, the blonde one. So she drove with me through Iran, and everybody in Iran was so friendly. Everywhere we stopped, someone wanted to jump in the car to be photographed. And anyway, we crossed into Turkey, and you can't quite see the top of the mountain, but it's that same mountain, Mount Ararat, that we passed by 40-odd years earlier. And now, of course, you go to Cappadocia in Turkey, and it's the world's hot air ballooning center. It's a fantastic place to go hot air ballooning. It's just incredible. So many hot air balloons alone is incredible, but the place is incredible. And we had a Chinese cameraman with us because the Chinese have thought we should make a movie, a TV thing about it. So we were followed by this Chinese film crew for most of our trip. And I went to more archaeological sites where I knew the archaeologists. But anyway, that trip started off here in Melbourne, not very far from here in Hawthorne, outside my garage. And that car drove all the way to my garage in London. And then I shipped it back here and sold it. But here in Melbourne, we've also done the Wheeler Centre, Books, Writing and Ideas. It's beside someone just mentioned it to me half an hour ago. Beside the State Library on Little Lonsdale Street. And one of the projects I did here in Melbourne a few years ago was making a 1-to-1 billion scale model of the solar system. There's the sun at 1-to-1 billion scale, and there's Saturn, which is about a half kilometre away. And if you go 6 kilometres along the bayside, you'll come to Pluto, which is not even a planet anymore, but it's very, very small. And that was a lot of fun to do. London Business School, where I graduated from, We've now got a professor of entrepreneurship who sits on my chair at the business school. Maureen, my wife, was the chair of the Melbourne Arts Festival, so she's very busy on that. But I'm just going to close with a few. I love people doing things, and I always think it's great when people right here in Melbourne are doing things. And these couple of young guys who work out in Clayton build state-of-the-art drones. They build bigger and bigger and bigger drones, and their most recent drones will lift 3 movie cameras simultaneously. So Hollywood filmmakers want to make 3D movies, can film them with these drones, which are made in Clayton. Now, Clayton is the world drone center due to these guys. Here they are filming Pirates of the Caribbean. They did all the drone work for that, and they had helicopters. And after a while, they thought, who needs helicopters when we can do it better with a drone? So these guys are right at the cutting edge of drone making, and it's here in Melbourne. Just outside is my Lotus, and just down Cremorne Street a little bit is the Melbourne Lotus dealer. Well, Lotus cars, you know, they're made in England, and they're sold everywhere in the world. And the cars are English, the engines are made by Toyota, but the supercharger, the thing on top that puts the air into the thing, is made in Preston. Harrop Engineering in Melbourne makes all the superchargers that go on all the Lotus cars they ship them from Preston to England, they're put in the cars, and then they're shipped off all around the world, and it's right here in Melbourne that it's done. And I just think that's fantastic. And a little project I helped to finance recently was my Plywood Bicycle. A guy out in Williamstown who makes these beautiful plywood bicycles. The whole thing is designed on computer. Every layer of millimeter thick plywood is cut out from the computer and then glued together. And he says, you know, it's the original carbon fiber. And it doesn't weigh, it weighs about 1/2 kilo more than the carbon fiber bicycle. And it's much more beautiful. Enough.
Oh, wow. Just give me 1 second here, guys. All right. So please sit down. I don't know how to keep going after that, but we've got another 20 minutes, so I'll make my attempt. And please, ask questions here. So, huh?
Real life.
Real life? What do you mean?
It's a real life, people to people. Put your hand up and ask a question.
Yeah, but people ask dumb questions. You got to just we crowdsource our questions here. Yeah, I'll give you one. There we go.
Just want to know how much effect did the people that you met along the way before you started writing Lonely Planet did have to actually create Lonely Planet?
Well, you know, the first Lonely Planet guide, before we started it, you know, we did Lonely Planet because there weren't guidebooks on this sort of stuff, you know. It was a virgin market, as it were. But when we started off from London, we did have a thing called the Bit Guide, and it was a computer bit of information. And Bit was this London Underground thing, and they basically, if you got busted for drugs and needed a lawyer, or you know, you were pregnant and needed an abortion, or you were homeless and needed somewhere to squat, Bit would sort of sort it out for you. But they made their money from these things called the Bit Guides. And Bit was just everybody, it was social media, you know, but they had to write it and put a stamp on the front and send it back and put that information together, and they sold them for £1. And you know, the information was totally, you know, some of it was pretty accurate and some of it was completely inaccurate. What were they smoking when they wrote that down, you know? But later on, the guy who put the Bit, you know, it was a 60s thing and it folded in the 70s. But the guy who put the Bit Guides together joined Lonely Planet, came out from London to Australia, and you know, helped put together a lot of the early Lonely Planet guides. So there was that sort of, you know, it was in a way that sort of social media thing. We were doing that before we were able to, it was postcards and letters rather than email and text messages.
We'll take a few more questions like this, all right? Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously you've had some incredible experiences, and I wonder, how did you consider drawing a balance between those experiences and building, you know, $1 million amazing multi-million-dollar business? How did you consider that?
You know, we didn't. We just did the things we wanted to do. And I look back on it now, you know, it was the right thing to do because we were here in Melbourne. You know, we had a number of offices here in Richmond. Richmond was one of them just over in where the Rosella Centre is. But you know, we were a little company in Melbourne, you know, and the big companies are in New York and London, and we couldn't compete with them, so we had to do things they weren't doing. So very much it was, if they're doing France and Mexico, which is, you know, big enough, and Spain and so on, we're going to do Pakistan and Nepal and Thailand. And later on, of course, Thailand became a huge destination, but it wasn't when we started. So we were looking for the unusual things, the out-of-the-way things, but also because we love those things. You know, we didn't want to go to Europe. We wanted to go to Asia or South America or Africa. So it was partly, you know, it was the right thing to do, going to the unusual things, looking for the niche. But it was also because that's what we really enjoyed.
So this is good segue, business stuff. Sit down, please. Let's do it. Let's do it. I'll try and continue to fireside chat mode right now, but and we'll take questions. So please, yeah. So can we go back? You know, we've got a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience and whatnot, and talk about some of the, you know, you touched on it here, but the scaling of Lonely Planet, and I guess what was the first big win after you had these publications?
The first really big win was we did a guidebook to India, and you know, we'd started off, and but there were little books we were doing. They were, you know, in pages. They were 200 or 300 pages, and back then they were selling for $2.95 or $3.95. Now it'd be $20, but you know, they were small. And then in 1980, so we've been going. We did the first book in. Really, the company really started in '75 when we came back from that Asia trip. So we've been going about 5 years, and we decided we could afford doing an India book, and we put 3 people into India. Maureen and I were one of the 3, and 2 other writers. One of them was that Bit Guide writer, and the 2 others, we gave them $1,000 each. We said, "Here's $1,000. Go off and spend 4 months in India and research it, you know, and you'll make money further down the line." That's it for now. And you know, we did this book, and instead of being 200 pages, it was more like 700. And instead of selling for $2.95, it sold for $14.95. And instead of selling 20, by that point, the books were selling 20,000 copies or 30,000 copies. The very first one we did was 1,500 copies. They were selling 20 or 30,000 copies, and suddenly this book sold 100,000 copies. So it was sort of a factor of 10 more expensive, and it was a factor of 10 more sales. So suddenly, boom, and then we took on more. We said, okay, you guys go to Indonesia, you go to China, you go there and do this and that. But it was still print. Yeah. You know, and that was print for a long time. I see the digital disruption questions come up here. You know, we were very early into computers, and doing guidebooks were perfect for computers because they weren't like a novel. You know, you write it and that's it forever. Guidebooks every 2 years, we updated them every 2 years. You've got to do the whole thing again. So having it all on a computer was perfect.
But to be fair, you kind of exited before like things started gaining momentum.
Well, we did, you know, we did a 94. Maureen and I, we had a US office by this point. We were starting to do guides to America. And we'd actually lived in America in the 80s for a year when we set up the American office. We went there and lived in San Francisco for a year. And 94, we decided, let's do a trip driving across America. We had kids by this point. School holidays, we'll go to America, we'll buy an old American car. We bought a '59 Cadillac. This car had no brakes to speak of, but it had a cigarette lighter for every seat. You know, and it was 25 years old then, so it was an old car in those days. But we started off from California, and we knew the people from O'Reilly Publications. The guy who, Tim O'Reilly, who invented the word, Net 2.0. We knew Tim O'Reilly, and we did a blog. The word blog hadn't been invented, but we had a very primitive mobile phone, and we sent back text every day to Tim O'Reilly, and they had a thing called Global Network Navigator, which was one of the really early websites in '94, and we did this daily blog about our travels on it. So we were sort of there at the beginning of it.
If you hung around, do you think that's where you would have naturally?
Well, I'm just looking today at what I've got no ownership of Lonely Planet anymore. I still help write things for them occasionally, and I'm still in touch with them. But I just got the update today of what they're doing. And a lot of their stuff now is online, and there's all sorts of apps and guidebooks you can download. I mean, I bought a half dozen Lonely Planet. I get them free still. It's amazing. Half dozen Lonely Planet guidebooks yesterday for my travels in the next few months, but not as books. I bought them to download on my iPad. You know, I read them as PDFs on my iPad, but there's all sorts of other apps. You can get them on your phone and everything else. And, you know, they're doing all sorts of digital things, but amazingly, books are still where a lot of the money is. And the last 4 years, despite the fact that book sales overall are going down, Lonely Planet's still going up. So they're getting a bigger share of a smaller market, but it's still working for them.
To kind of circle back around to, you know, growing this company out globally, and you just mentioned that, you know, you'd send some of your employees on adventures and stuff. How do you? I always ask the question about scaling culture. How do you keep the fun under wraps and the serious head on? You know,
a lot of it is people come. I always say, you know, if you want to get into any sort of business at all, do something you love. Because, you know, first of all, if it doesn't make any money, at least you've had a good time doing it. And secondly, if you're doing something you love, everybody else picks up on that as well. You know, they come to you because they can see you're enjoying it. And I don't think I've ever seen a really successful business, whether it's making fast cars or wooden bicycles or camera drones, where it isn't the people doing it because they're in love with doing it. And I think I spent 45 minutes with Bill Gates once. You know, and he didn't set out to be the richest man in the world because he wanted to be the richest man in the world. He set out because he was a computer geek who loved doing computer stuff. And I think that's true of any sort of business. So if you do something you love, and then the people who come to work with you, they've come to you because they love what you're doing as well. They want to work with you because they believe in the same things that you believe in. So it's, you know, self-actualizing in a way.
Can I ask another question that kind of comes up, I guess, in startup land too, where it's quite common to talk about, you know, the venture capitalist wants two founders, and one's usually business, one's technical, and so on and so forth. Mate, that's the way to do it. Keep
I know,
going,
just they're right there. I just have to reach over.
It's easy. Your founder, your co-founder, and you know, is your wife.
Yeah, and you know, Maureen and I have often talked about this. That how did we manage to stay married over these years? And really, the thing is, I think any business where there's two of you, whether it's business partners or, in our case, husband and wife, you've got to sort of demark. You doing this and I'm doing that. And, you know, we're not going to step on each other's toes. And you know, I got the MBA, but really she's far more business-like than I am. And I was always. You know,
I always ask for her to talk to you.
I know, she never comes.
Nah.
She doesn't want to. Maureen's view on this is, I've been there, I've done it, I don't want to talk about it anymore. And you know, she was the more business-like one, and she's much better at that stuff. You know, she's the president of the Melbourne Arts Festival, you know, and she's got to keep everybody in line and keep the government on side as well. I couldn't do that stuff. It would drive me up the wall. You know, I enjoy. I love putting the books together. You know, I love getting the idea for it and getting the team together who are going to do it, and then I love doing it myself as well, going out there and researching it and so on. So I love that creative side of it, but the business side of it, I was hopeless at. You know, you had to have somebody else who could do that, and she was it.
Perfect. Last time we sat in here for the December event, we had the founder of Redbubble, Martin Hoskin, sitting here. And I asked him the question about work-life balance, so I'll get in there too. And it was quite refreshing to hear him, you know, more often than not, it's this kind of work hard till you die and kind of mantra. And he was quite the opposite, and he didn't answer emails on the weekend and very much wanted his staff to go home at 5 p.m. What is your take on work-life balance for the entrepreneur?
I think a lot of people who are entrepreneurial, they're doing something that they love so much. If they weren't getting paid for it, they'd still be doing it. You know, and the whole time I was doing the books, I loved doing them, and I still love travel. You know, I'm really disappointed if a year goes by, I don't get to go to a few new places. I'm going to Eritrea in a month's time. So I've never been to Eritrea, and you know, the architecture in Asmara is really fascinating, and you know, I really want to see it. And I've got a couple other trips later in the year, which it isn't like I've got some real fascination about the place, but I've never been there, and it's sort of, why have I never been there? I should. So you know, I still have this fascination of going places, much more so than Maureen does. Maureen says, you go. You know, she doesn't want to. There are lots of places I go to, she doesn't. When I did the book Badlands, I really had to go to Iraq. If I was going to go to the places that George Bush had said were seriously bad, evil, I had to go to Iraq. But Iraq wasn't really the best place to go to at that time. And I was speaking at a conference in Singapore, and then a week later I was speaking at a conference in Washington, D.C., both tourism conferences. And I thought, Singapore, Washington, D.C., what's right in between them? Iraq. I'll just drop in Iraq, which is what I did. And but I hadn't told Maureen I was going there. So, I got to the border between Turkey and Iraq, and they've got a big, it's going to the Kurdistan region, and there's a big sign up saying, "Welcome to the Kurdish region of Iraq." So I got two of the Peshmerga soldiers to stand beside me with their guns on each side, and my taxi driver to do sort of a selfie, and I said to Maureen, I said, "Oh, I stopped off on my way to Washington, D.C. Here I am." I've only been in Iraq for a few days. It'll all be fine. And it was. Places are never as bad as the media says. That's my view.
Is there a lot of pressure off, or do you find that you enjoy these trips much more than now that you don't have writing deadlines, or you just can't help but write anyway?
I write anyway. If I go there and I find something wrong, I still travel with the Lonely Planet guides. I find something wrong, I write and tell them about it. And there's always something that you pick up on. And no, I still really enjoy it. And if I wasn't doing this, I'd be doing this. So there you go.
Let me get some of these questions going. Yeah, this is a good question. As you were saying that, I was thinking, I think anyone that's travelled a little bit has found themselves in some unique situations. I think you'd be in some more than most. And so, what are some of the craziest situations you've found yourself?
Well, most of the dodgy situations are you're always in taxis. And it can be right here in Melbourne. There's been more Melbourne taxi drivers. I think, where did you learn to drive? Uber. I've got to say, Uber has better drivers than the yellow ones. I'm not surprised they've done so well in Melbourne. And, other places in the world, I'm equally happy in the taxis or Uber. But here, I've got to say my money's on Uber. Dodgy situations have been, I've never had a serious thing. I've been mugged once or twice, but never seriously. No one's really held a knife to me once in Colombia.
Well, tell me that story. You can't brush over the knife into the throat in Colombia.
That's the only time. Every time I've had things stolen a few times, and it's always been from my own carelessness. You get pickpocketed. It's because you're not paying enough attention, or you should never leave a bag on the seat of a car because that's an invitation to have your car broken into, or never leave things in hotel rooms unless any time I've had anything stolen, except this one occasion in Colombia where. It seemed like a safe area. It seemed, lots of people around, and suddenly someone's standing in front of me and someone behind me has got a knife, and I gave them my camera. Unfortunately, they didn't get my phone, they didn't get my wallet, they didn't get anything important at all. You can get another camera quite easily. I missed the photographs I took that day, but there you go. Back up regularly.
What is the best preparation going to these dangerous countries?
Oh, look, read up on them, and I always do read up on them. But my view is that they're never as dangerous as. Actually, the dangerous country that I've never been to, that people say, where have you not been to? You want to, is Yemen, and I just regret that why have I not been to Yemen? Because there's been Yemen is right now it's just terrible, but it's never been terrific. But it's been sort of up and down, and every time when it's been a little bit up, for some reason I didn't get there. And it just seems like everybody I know who's been to Yemen is a really interesting person. I've met archaeologists who've been there. It's got amazing archaeology. It's got these mud skyscrapers. They're mud construction, but they're skyscrapers. And you look at these photographs of the cities in Yemen, and you think, oh, I want to go there. But I've never been there. And I really want to one day. So I hope it gets better again.
Should we poll the room and just see who in the room's been to Yemen and make you feel better?
Yeah, I would. Who has been to Yemen here?
There you go.
There you go. See, at least.
I haven't, but
Yeah, go ahead. Is this stand-up comedy?
Just, I do like army reserves on the side, and Yemen's one of the very few countries where if you're like a part of the defence force, you need written approval from a general, like an army general, to actually go to Yemen. It's like it's just on the total blacklist. It's quite.
It's a.
Makes it more desirable.
I know it does. And, you know, about must be 15 years ago. I was when Yemen was okay. I was at a tourism thing in Sydney, and I was talking about, and Yemen came up. And somebody, you know, over this side of the room said, well, I went to Yemen last year and I got kidnapped. And someone over this side said, oh, I got kidnapped too. And it almost seemed like if you went to Yemen and you didn't get kidnapped, you went to your travel agency, I didn't get kidnapped, why not? And funnily enough, I'm actually reading a book at the moment, and in this book, this guy goes to Yemen only about 4 years ago. And he said, and he's talking to someone in Yemen, and they're saying, you know, so many people got kidnapped in Yemen, people were complaining if they didn't get kidnapped. And so yeah, who knows, maybe Yemen's like that.
I'm going to just sidetrack for a second here, and we haven't touched quite, you know, you touched on it a few slides, but the work that you do with charities and some of these foundations and stuff, what are some of your most proud moments with some of the you know?
Well, you know, some of them, one of the first ones we got involved with was Surf Aid. And this was Nias Island off the coast of West Sumatra, which is a popular place for surfers, you know, great waves and so on. And surfers are, you know, a lot of them have got a lot of money. They can sort of go off and surf around, and a surprising number of doctors are surfers. And some doctors have been there, and when the waves were bad, they got sort of called into the local village to do a little bit of medical help. And they were thinking, you know, we're surfers and we're wealthy to be from Australia here having a holiday and surfing. You know, maybe we should put something back into medical assistance in these places. And they started an organisation called Surf Aid, and Lonely Planet was one of the first people to put money into Surf Aid. And, you know, and I'm pretty sure it's still going, but it was a really good project. And I've seen this in Nepal. Fred Hollows, who started the cataract surgery thing, you know, that was in Nepal. And a lot of that was because a lot of doctors go trekking in Nepal, and they see that Nepal has a lot of problems with, you know, eye cataracts and things. And so that happens there. It's similar things have happened in Ethiopia. I've been to quite a few places where this has happened, where doctors have been traveling and thought, well, hey, we should put some effort back into this. I know a really fancy resort in Fiji, Turtle Island, and once a year, Turtle Island closes down the resort for 2 weeks, and they bring all these doctors in, and they put this message out for all the islands around that area that we've got a 2-week sort of surgery camp, and if you need something done, you know, you've got a kid with a cleft palate, come into this place and you can probably get it done in the next 2 weeks. And all these doctors come in there and they stay in the wonderful rooms at Turtle Island, and, you know, they do 2 weeks of surgery.
When I think Lonely Planet, I almost think it kind of goes hand in hand, the philanthropic work, or I think it's kind of woven into your DNA. When did this, was it from travelling that you wanted to give back? It was travelling, yeah, and what started it was, you know, the Live Aid thing in Ethiopia. That I'm just going to tell an Ethiopia story in a minute. You know, all that famine was going on, and the rock stars were getting up and doing things in Ethiopia, and we thought, we're making money out of Africa with a guidebook to there. We should put some money back in, and it was Friday night, you know, after pub session, after the office closed on Friday, and Maureen and I and Jim, our partner, we said, well, why don't we put a percentage of our profits each year back into projects in the places that we're doing books about, and we, you know, started up there and then doing that. And it was just because the business had got, at that stage, wealthy enough that it could do it. And we carried on ever since, and then when we sold the business, we couldn't say you've bought a charity as well as a business, so we pulled it out of Lonely Planet. But if I said I'd tell an Ethiopia story. If I go back and say the proudest moment I've got from Lonely Planet was Ethiopia. And, you know, there was that long civil war there, Mengistu, who was the evil dictator, and he was supported by the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union was falling apart, and the rebels were closing in on Addis Ababa,
And Mengistu now is living in Harare in Zimbabwe because Mugabe looked after him for years, and I don't know what's going to happen to him long term. Anyway, Mengistu was about to fall over, and the rebels had captured these tanks, and they were closing in on Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. And there was one journalist who wrote a book about it called The Zanzibar Chest. And he was the only journalist who was with the rebels. And when they were about a day or two outside of Addis Ababa, the rebel commander came over to him and said, look, we've got a real problem. We've got these Russian tanks we've captured and all these men. He said, but my men, most of them have never been in Addis Ababa. And, and it was 20 years ago when I was young that I was last there. And we're afraid we're going to get into Addis Ababa and we're going to get lost on the way to the palace or the headquarters to take over. And he said, we've got no idea how to find our way through Addis Ababa. And this guy who wrote the book said, the only thing I had was my Lonely Planet guidebook. But he said it had a map of Addis Ababa in it. And he said, and they had a photocopier, and they took it away and they photocopied the map, and they distributed the map around all the tanks. So as the tanks were driving into Addis Ababa, they were following the Lonely Planet map. And I thought, great, we recommend cheap hotels, nice restaurants, and occasionally we get to overthrow governments. Yeah. Turn by the cheap hotel, miss that restaurant, and there's the palace.
That's awesome. Any regrets about selling the company to BBC? This is, I guess, a great question because you got a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience looking for that big exit and stuff,
Yeah, well, we sold to BBC worldwide, and we thought that the BBC were a great buyer, and then it all went wrong, and they were all this politics were involved, and it turned out we just sold it at a time when the BBC sort of everybody loves it, and then the government changes and everybody hates it, and it's up and down, and it was not a good time. And instead of sort of getting into the driver's seat and putting their foot down, they sort of got into the driver's seat and started looking at the speed limit signs and driving really carefully. And the BBC had it for about 5 years, and it really didn't go all that well. And then they sold it to these Americans. And remarkably, I was at the Lonely Planet office in London a couple of months ago, and they were saying it's all much better now with the Americans owning it than the BBC. So at the moment, it seems to be working fine.
Was there that bitter?
Was there regret? Yeah. It was time to change. I mean, and what we say that we loved running the business the whole time, and the business was definitely becoming more digital. And I said about loving what you're doing, and we loved the digital stuff from the start, but we weren't obsessed with it. That wasn't, it was the 18-year-olds who were obsessed with it, and we weren't 18 years old anymore, and we thought, time for a change.
Brilliant.
So I don't regret selling out, but there you go.
If you could recommend any single location to travel to, where would it be? I think you mentioned a few, but it's like a load of quick.
I love them. I love them all, and I love going back to places that who doesn't like going back to Italy? And you love going back there, and you love doing these things again, and so I love the go back to places as well. But also I love going somewhere new every year. The most recent new one I've been to, I went to Kiribati, which is one of those places that it's only a meter above sea level and it's going to disappear. But I just found it really interesting, and I really had an interesting time in Kiribati, and so I like going to the places I haven't been to before. That's what makes them interesting, but I like going back to places as well. So I'm going back to Berlin in a couple of months' time. I've got some Berlin friends staying with me tomorrow.
I'm going to jump one question here to this. It was interesting that you talked about the drones and the bike. Is there a few investments that Tony Wheeler's been doing along the way? There's kind of venture capitalists in the background?
The drone people, I've got no money in them, and I'm sort of listed on their thing of advisors. Chemical Media, which Lonely Planet had a television segment and was doing television stuff. And one of the things we thought was when the BBC took over, BBC television, this would be the area that really grew. And instead, the total opposite happened, because the BBC sat there thinking, ooh, if we put money into that, everyone will say that, we're only doing, it's only doing well because it's got BBC money behind it. So instead of pushing it up, it sort of pushed it down. And eventually the people who ran Lonely Planet Television pulled out and set up a new company called Chemical Media, which I have invested in. But you know, it's not done wonders, but it's fun to do.
The bike, or
The bike?
anyone that's coming here, is there certain things you look for, or it's just like a...
The guy who did the bicycle, I met him, you know, he's doing all sorts of other art things, and I met him and he said, I've just had this fascination about wooden bicycles, and I've made more and more sophisticated ones, and I've got to the stage now where I think I could actually make one, instead of just making them for myself, make one for somebody else. So the one that I showed the picture of, he actually made 4 of those, one for the Timber Council in Canberra, 2 other people have bought them as well, but you know, it was a sophisticated bicycle, and he did a beautiful job on it, and I ride it, you know, several times a week. You know, I'll be riding it over to Prahran. I won't be riding to Prahran tomorrow morning, but usually I ride to the gym on Wednesdays usually.
Can't miss you at all.
Yeah, my wooden bicycle.
All right, we'll take one last one here.
How many countries have you still to cross off your list? There's a question.
Yeah, all right. Or
We'll answer
why
that.
did you call it Lonely Planet?
Why did
Or
we call it
what's-
Lonely Planet? We'll answer both those. We called it Lonely Planet. We needed a name for the business. And we were in Sydney when we did the first book. And we'd had a little bit too much red wine. We were kicking around names. And we'd just been to see a movie called Mad Dogs and Englishmen. Rock and roll band on the road. Joe Cocker, now dead. Leon Russell, only died a year or so ago. Going around America. And there was a song in the movie called Space Captain, and Joe Cocker sings, "Once while traveling across the sky, this lonely planet caught my eye." And I said to Maureen, doesn't that sound nice? Lonely planet catching my eye. Why don't we call it Lonely Planet? She said, great idea. Except actually he sings Lovely Planet. So I mean, it's been a mistake all those years. It's been, sorry about this, but it should have been Lovely Planet.
I want everyone back on their feet, and a big thank you to Tony for coming out tonight.